In 1883, which was the period during which Nietzsche produced his most famous material, the books of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes the following note, quote, "Only now has it dawned on humanity that music is a semiological language of the affects, and later we will learn how to recognize clearly the impulsive system of a musician through his music. In truth, he did not intend to betray himself in this manner. Such is the innocence of this type of confession, as opposed to every written work. Yet this innocence also exists in the great philosophers. They are not conscious that they are speaking of themselves. They would claim it would be a question of the truth when at bottom it is only a question of themselves. Or rather, their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impudence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It wants to be sovereign and, if possible, the aim of everything and every event. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak. There are many more languages than we think, and man betrays himself more often than he desires. How things speak! But there are very few listeners, so that man can only, as it were, chatter on in the void when he pours out his confessions. He squanders his truths as the sun does its light. Isn't it rather a pity that the void has no ears? There are ways of seeing that make man feel this alone is true and just, and truly human. Whoever thinks otherwise is making an error. Ways of seeing we term religious and moral. It is clear that what is speaking here is the sovereign impulse, which is stronger than man. In each case, the impulse believes it holds the truth and the supreme concept of man. This, then, is the first characteristic. Every coherent system of a philosopher demonstrates that one impulse directs it, that there is a fixed hierarchy in it. This is what is then called truth. And the felt sensation can be described thus. With this truth, I am at the height of man." End quote. These words of Nietzsche, contained in an unpublished note, express ideas that most who are familiar with Nietzsche will recognize, for example, in The Gay Science, where he argues that many justifications for life are possible, many moral philosophies are possible. What matters is which philosophy allows its possessor to feel satisfied with himself. He says, this is the one needful thing in life, to be able to affirm one's life. But morality and the religious modes of thought, which Nietzsche identifies here, are dogmatic. They attempt to establish one moral justification for life once and for all, one set of habits, one set of mores, based on the abstracted, universal concerns for mankind as a whole. Or we might think of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche makes the claim that every philosophy is the involuntary confession of its author. And there he'll also assert that in every philosophical system, one ruling thought, one ruling impulse is active. In the case of moral regimes or religious moralities, it's an impulse that's become hardened and rigidified, an impulse that's no longer experienced as an impulse, but as an enduring fact, even an objective fact. And of course, this is what Nietzsche would write in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that every thou shalt, every divine morality begins as an I will, as a human value judgment, a valuation and estimation with a human origin. These insights about the nature of thought, quite on their own, are both profound and dangerous in a way. But Nietzsche's focus here in this note from 1883 involves this fascinating comparison to music. And he says music can be read as a semiology of the impulses of the musician. So music is a semiological language of the affects, which means a sign language, a code of signifiers for the instincts that drove the composer. And Nietzsche says it's barely dawned on us that music is such a code of signifiers, and yet he goes even further and says philosophy is just the same. So on the one hand, you could analyze a musical composition from the mathematical standpoint of music theory, Or you could attempt to understand perhaps the emotional narrative of a piece of music, attempt to identify at which point in the composition certain affects or certain passions flare up and make themselves known in the music. And similarly, we might read philosophy in a different manner from the one who reads it simply to decipher what the philosopher is consciously saying. We could instead decipher it as an unconscious confession of what the philosopher is feeling, what impulses, which come into our experience as passions or emotions, what impulses are behind the philosophy. And perhaps the most subversive idea contained in this note is in the sentence, quote, "The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak," end quote. So is the philosopher the one speaking? No, it's the impulse that speaks through him. The philosopher is a vessel. He's seized on by the impulses. And as we know from Nietzsche's other remarks elsewhere, he considers the impulses to be the true self, as it were, and not the ego consciousness. The real self is in the body. It is the body. The body is a chance occurrence created by the drives, by the impulses. In fact, the impulses are themselves older than any particular form of the body, any particular type of organism, we might say. It's the impulse toward pleasure, away from pain, the impulse to procreate or to survive or to find nourishment and so on. This pre-exists any type of body or species or animals. Impulses aren't really something that we quote-unquote have, therefore. Instead, impulses created us. Impulses have a body. And thus, who we are, your identity as a human being, is not it's not a determination made by one's rational or voluntary choice. Instead, it's a fortuitous, or in some cases unfortuitous, product of competing impulses that bring forth this person or that person without any rhyme or reason, or more importantly, without any intentionality. Now, these positions of Nietzsche's are challenging enough to consider on their own, but in the work of Pierre Klossowski, one of the most impressive interpreters of Friedrich Nietzsche ever to write about him, in my opinion, Klossowski operates from the method of applying Nietzsche's interpretation of philosophy to Nietzsche himself, to Nietzsche's own philosophy. So, in other words, to ask, what then is Nietzsche's confession? What does the semiotic of his philosophical work tell us about those impulses that spoke through the philosopher named Nietzsche in order to write down these ideas? What does his philosophical work signify? And in a somewhat paradoxical manner, we must apply Nietzsche's method in order to ask what Nietzsche's method itself reveals about the kind of impulses driving the method. So what kind of man attempts to place the impulses above the consciousness? What kind of philosopher makes the linguistic, the coherent, the rational into errors? And who holds instead that in the total economy of life, all of these things are precarious mutations in a fundamentally non-rational world, a state of total flux? Why would Nietzsche, who's writing down his thoughts, say that all thought is driven by that which is unconscious and unspoken? The fact that we find Nietzsche's claims so unusual and largely unprecedented in the history of philosophy is also telling. As Klossowski writes, quote, "Neither Descartes, nor Spinoza, nor Kant, nor Hegel would have been able to construct their systems if, by some chance, they had renounced a teachable coherence in order to speak of existence from their own lived experience." End quote. And yet, as Nietzsche says in the note from 1883, it is not a question of the truth for these philosophers, but only a question of themselves. Klossowski writes, quote, "Nietzsche maintains that they have only complied with a secret concern to express the movements of their own moods." End quote. If philosophy is just an expression of moods, then why were previous philosophers so, quote-unquote, ignorant of this fact? Rather, the question that concerns us is really the inverse of that. What makes Nietzsche different from them? If a thought is a signifier of an impulse, what unusual kind of impulse wants to tear away that mask of thought and reveal that it is indeed an impulse-driving thought. You could even argue it might be better served if the impulse remains behind this mask. What would make Nietzsche different from all these other figures? That he makes this kind of move in his philosophy that none of the others made. The fruit of this method, of applying Nietzsche's semiology of the impulses to Nietzsche himself, is Klossowski's monumental work entitled Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, which manages to be one of the most powerful critiques of Nietzsche's philosophy, and yet also as compelling a presentation of his philosophy as any. Klossowski achieves the seemingly impossible in Nietzsche's scholarship, given that so much has already been written about him, in that he joins the ranks of Heidegger, Girard, Deleuze, and a few others who present a novel understanding of the core doctrines of Nietzsche. If I may be so bold, I would say that it is almost impossible to come away from reading Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle without having your view of Nietzsche's philosophy, and especially of the eternal return, transformed, or at least reevaluated to some extent. So today we're going to begin with our analysis of that book, but first a brief word on Klossowski, the person. Pierre Klossowski was a French philosopher and translator, though he came from Polish ancestry. In fact, his family were originally of the minor nobility of Poland. He was born in 1905 in Paris. When he was a young man in 1923, he worked for the author André Paul Guillaume Gide as his secretary, and he helped Gide with some of the drafts of his works. Gide was part of the symbolist movement in literature. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in the year 1947, although he had a somewhat sordid personal life that we're not going to go into here. Suffice to say, it seems to be a theme with many French writers and intellectuals, but we don't need to saddle Klossowski with any of that because he was only 18 when he worked for him. We can only really speculate as to how much he really knew about any of this. Klossowski went on to write for Assertion in the 1930s, which is Bataille's review, and he was undoubtedly influenced by Bataille. He's responsible for translating a number of German authors: Heidegger, Nietzsche, Hölderlin, Wittgenstein, Kafka, Walter Benjamin. Klossowski is primarily known for his studies of philosophical thinkers, one of which is Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, which was itself influential on both Foucault and Deleuze, as well as his study of the Marquis de Sade. Klossowski died in the year 2001 in the same city as that of his birth, Paris. Now, in light of these considerations that Klossowski makes about the implications of Nietzsche's fundamental philosophical assertions as regards Nietzsche's own work, Klossowski argues that Nietzsche cannot be considered a philosophical teacher. And true enough, this is why Nietzsche said he would rather be regarded as a buffoon than a saint, and why Zarathustra told his students to repudiate him and to find their own way. Klossowski writes, quote, "What then did Spinoza or Kant do? Nothing but interpret their dominant impulse. But it was only the communicable part of their behavior that could be translated into their constructions. What this means is that Nietzsche rejected, purely and simply, the attitude of the philosopher-teacher. He made fun of himself for not being a philosopher, if by that we mean a thinker who thinks and teaches out of a concern for the human condition. What are the thoughts and experiences of a philosopher worth if they serve merely to guarantee the society from which he comes?" End quote. And I would say this is a familiar Nietzschean critique of philosophy, as Klossowski phrases it here. The philosopher, as Nietzsche puts it, has only been a kind of a subspecies of priest, a shepherd, to whom the herd can look for a rational justification of the collective values and judgments about reality that they already hold. Nietzsche rejects this role, but it would seem that he would have to reject any role as a teacher, even as a teacher of a select few. For what could Nietzsche teach them? Well, certainly nothing other than the ideas that they are primed by their own life and their own experiences, their own impulses, to accept. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science number 286, quote, "Here are hopes, but what will you hear or see of them if you have not experienced splendor, ardor and dawns in your own souls. I can only remind you, more I cannot do." End quote. The long-standing concern with establishing some sort of prescriptive philosophy out of Nietzsche's work would therefore seem to be a fool's errand. Really, the notion that there is any course of action demanded by Nietzsche or any transformation of society that ought to be affected by his work, that would seem to be an impossible perspective. Nietzsche's orientation towards the human being as a vessel of impulses would deny freedom of the will and moral responsibility. Really, any set of universal principles for human behavior. All we would have would be chance relations of tension between drives, which produce outcomes that the consciousness can signify to itself, can bring into representation, but never affect, because the consciousness is itself an effect. In other words, all is fate. Every being is a piece of fate. The choice is only whether to affirm that fate, to will one's fate just as it is, or to reject it, to will instead for some other fate. And thus we have the doctrine of the amor fati, the love of fate, which Nietzsche says is his formula for the greatness of a human being. But this may present us with a puzzle, because Nietzsche, especially in his early years, is particularly concerned with the problems of culture. He critiques the contemporary German culture and European culture in general, and he unfavorably contrasts the culture of Europe post-Enlightenment after millennia of Christianity with the pre-Christian Hellenic pagans of the Greek world. There are also numerous attacks within his work against the socialists, the anarchists, all those whom Nietzsche believed wished to level mankind, to equalize all individuals into one mass collective. As Klossowski says, what it is that Nietzsche opposes is so vast and expansive, it's difficult to really encapsulate it in a single word. Yes, its roots are Christian. It's the bourgeois culture with its cosmopolitan sensibilities and the mechanistic understanding of nature. You could call it Philistinism, the false culture, for example, in Germany, in which people have become, as Nietzsche says, walking encyclopedias of facts, but are never indoctrinated into the deep questions of culture. They never have to integrate those impersonal realities that everyone, he calls them impersonal because they're things that everyone has to face, so not just personal conflicts, but the sort of eternal questions of life. We never have to integrate the answers that our culture gives into our lives. Culture just, in education, just sort of becomes, again, accruing a bunch of trivial facts. And so the many-headed hydra that Nietzsche combats includes all of these, but it's really defined by none of them. Perhaps the closest we can get, perhaps by analogy, is considering the moral ideology of utilitarianism, which makes pleasure and pain into the positive and negative values of human life. It universalizes these values by assuming pleasure and pain are always experienced as positive and negative, respectively, to the same degree, or at least to perhaps a similar degree in all people. And it attempts to quantize pleasure and pain into fungible units, which can then be minimized or maximized in order to solve the moral problems of society. Now, again, utilitarianism even is not the all-encompassing name for the problem that Nietzsche combats in his early career with his culture war. It's simply, in my opinion, an exemplary iteration of the problem. It's very clear that Nietzsche wishes to oppose this type of ideology, but in light of his broader philosophy, it seems very unclear how it is that he intends to combat it through a philosophical work of all things. Furthermore, we might also ask, why are these ideas of modernity, these cultural memes of modernity, something that Nietzsche wishes to combat in the first place? How can Nietzsche make an accusation against socialism, Philistinism, utilitarianism, mechanistic views of the world, and so on and so forth, if what they represent is simply a different set of instincts? As he writes in The Gay Science, it isn't clear that any ideology or set of behaviors that man can come up with can really damage or harm the species. He writes, quote, "What might have harmed the species may have become extinct many thousands of years ago," end quote. And he says in that book that even the most evil people have helped the species in their way, and that no matter what ideas about reality we adopt, that's just another seduction of nature, a seduction to see value in life. If Nietzsche does not intend to make a moral judgment as regards the struggle with modern culture, what kind of judgment is he making? And further, how is such a judgment sensible? How can it be motivating or effective to make such a judgment? How does it change anything? Klossowski writes, quote, "For Nietzsche, the moral question of knowing what is true or false, just or unjust, could now be posed in the following terms. What is sick or healthy? What is gregarious or singular? It seemed to Nietzsche, who was himself subject to valetudinary variations and constantly feared that his own thought showed the effects of his depressive states, that it would be equally revelatory to examine the forms of thought put forward by previous thinkers from the viewpoint of their relation to life, to the living, that is, from the viewpoint of the rises and falls of intensity in all their various forms, aggressiveness, tolerance, intimidation, anguish, the need for solitude, or on the contrary, the forgetting of oneself in the midst of the turmoil of an epoch." Nietzsche therefore judged morality to be the principal metaphysical virus of thought and science. Nietzsche writes, quote, "I see all philosophers, I see science kneeling before a reality that is the reverse of the struggle for existence as taught by Darwin's school. That is to say, I see on top and surviving everywhere those who compromise life and the value of life." End quote. And back to Klossowski, continuing, quote, "The mediocre dominate those surplus natures whose overabundance of life is a threat to the security of the species. There are therefore two powers, the leveling power of gregarious thought and the erectile power of particular cases." This allowed Nietzsche to identify those metaphysical systems commanded by moralities whose only aim is to perpetuate the reign of gregarious norms and instincts. Any system that does not receive their approval cannot survive. But there also exist systems that are impracticable to the greatest number, and which are consecrated to a particular case, Heraclitus, Spinoza, and others that form a code reserved purely for a limited group, La Rochefoucauld. The metaphysics of Kant, by contrast, harbors a behavior that Nietzsche summarized in the image of the fox who returns to his cage after having broken out of it. End quote. So I think this answers many of the questions about how Nietzsche will come to understand his role in philosophy and how he intends to carry out his struggle with modern culture. What is sick or healthy? And what is gregarious or singular? And as he says, he believes that in the realm of thought, what is sick has become gregarious, has become common. It's the opposite of the Darwinian struggle for existence, the opposite of a selection process that produces stronger, better organisms. In the realm of thought, which includes philosophy, religion, morality, the herd selects for those doctrines that compromise life, compromise the value of life. And it's only in particular, singular, or peculiar cases, or limited cases, in the moral philosophies created by those who speak for a limited group, or only for themselves, that it's even possible to posit a way of thought that does not compromise the value of life. In other words, Nietzsche makes the rather strange claim that health is expressed as an exception and sickness is expressed as a rule. So why does Nietzsche feel he is an authority to speak on the health or the sickness of an idea? Well, because he contains health and sickness within himself. This is what he believes and what he writes in Ecce Homo, his autobiographical work. Nietzsche opens the main text of that work with the following paragraph. Quote, "The good fortune of my existence, its uniqueness perhaps, lies in its fatality. I am, to express it in the form of a riddle, already dead as my father, while as my mother I am still living and becoming old. This dual descent, as it were, from both the highest and the lowest rung on the ladder of life, at the same time a decadent and a beginning. This, if anything, explains that neutrality, that freedom from all partiality in relation to the total problem of life, that perhaps distinguishes me. I have a subtler sense of smell for the signs of ascent and decline than any other human being before me. I am the teacher par excellence for this. I know both. I am both. End quote. And, of course, there's another paradox here because Klossowski has just argued that Nietzsche is not a philosophical teacher, and yet he's saying he's a teacher par excellence, but we might say he's a teacher insofar as he can instruct us as to where health and sickness lies, not necessarily as regards objective truth or something like that. But to put this into concrete terms, consider Nietzsche's illness. From the age of 9 onwards, he experiences these crippling migraine headaches. And these would happen in bouts that sometimes lay him out for days at a time, sometimes accompanied by stomach pains and vomiting. And he developed near blindness, especially in his right eye. And these migraines, along with dizziness and the near blindness, prompted his early retirement from the university, pretty much ended his career as a philologist. And the way that Nietzsche writes about his illness is rather fascinating. As he says here, he contains both the highest and the lowest rung on the ladder of life within himself. He is both a decadent and a beginning. So he contains sickness, illness, decadence, which he will later define decadence. We often think of this as like a political term, but he defines it in a physiological sense. He says corruption or decadence, it's really just the same as physiological sickness. In a way, they're synonyms. But of course, he also contains within health, ascent, convalescence. And to put this in slightly more concrete terms, Nietzsche praises his own nervous system in a letter to his mother as a way of telling her not to worry about him. He's not pursuing the cures that she thinks he should pursue at that time. But he says in the letter, I've already pursued new cures. None of them have worked. Some of them may have even harmed me. But my nervous system is strong. It's sensitive, but it's strong. He says in that letter, from now on, I'm going to be my own physician. And we might recall the passage from Ecce Homo where he writes that when a doctor examined him, he admitted, quote, there is nothing wrong with your nerves. It is simply that I am nervous, end quote. So Nietzsche has this illness within him. And given that his father died when he was very young from an unexplained cause that the attending physician called liquefaction of the brain, there's probably some truth to Nietzsche associating his weakness or his sickliness with his paternal line of descent. But he also has this strong nervous system of which he seems to be proud. So Nietzsche can say, I contain within me both sickness and health, both the illness, which is part of my body, and the nervous system, which is strong enough to overcome the illness, which is also, obviously, my body. And further, Nietzsche then goes so far as to take note of the thoughts that he has while in bouts of illness, at his lowest points, versus the thoughts that he has while at his highest points. Klossowski writes, quote, Nietzsche never hesitated to say that certain of his books were written while his health was at such and such a point. For example, at the moment he felt it to be at its lowest point. End quote. So this is how Nietzsche develops his authority or his self-proclaimed authority on health and sickness as he asks himself continuously, which are the thoughts that are a product of suffering? Which are the thoughts that occur in the absence of suffering? And this is a key idea that we will return to in a short while. But this, I think, can help unriddle the question of how Nietzsche engages the struggle with culture and the implications in light of his broader philosophy, rather than a set of prescriptions for how to fix the so-called problems of culture. Nietzsche provides a new descriptive framework with the aim of identifying when an idea is the product of health or sickness, and given this framework, we can then say descriptively that sickness routinely prevails in the realm of morality and religion especially, whereas the healthy ideas are only ever the product of an exceptional case. He claims authority for himself in this matter through his body, through the impulses that he has, and most importantly, through the physical and therefore mental states that he experiences, particularly his valetudinary states, which means the states of ill health. states of concern about his health. Now, before we move on to discuss Klossowski's analysis of Nietzsche's semiotic of impulses, how it relates to the valetudinary states, it's worth considering a concrete example of why Nietzsche felt the gregarious modern culture was in such a state of sickness, why he made this judgment. What is it about this leveling impulse, the rising tide of egalitarianism, socialism, anarchism, and so on, that is so manifestly sick? And Klossowski cites a letter which may be a fascinating insight into his thought process. Nietzsche wrote to his friend Karl von Gersdorff in 1871 about a report that he'd read of the communards, the members of the Paris Commune, setting fires in Paris. And this was likely part of like a desperate final military strategy. And the Tuileries Palace was one of the sites that burned. And Nietzsche seems to express the belief in this letter that the communards had consciously attacked art and culture as a kind of revenge for the social misery that was a product of that culture. Again, the fires were likely a sort of a desperate Hail Mary strategy, something like that. But nevertheless, that's how Nietzsche seems to interpret it. So he writes to Karl von Gersdorff, quote, "We all bear the guilt that such a terror could come to light, so that we must make sure we do not ascribe to those unfortunates alone the crime of a combat against culture." I know what that means. The combat against culture. When I heard of the fires in Paris, I felt for several days annihilated and was overwhelmed by fears and doubts. The entire scholarly, scientific, philosophical, and artistic existence seemed an absurdity if a single day could wipe out the most glorious works of art, even whole periods of art. I clung with earnest conviction to the metaphysical value of art, which cannot exist for the sake of impoverished people, but which has higher missions to fulfill. But even when the pain was at its worst, I could not cast a stone against those blasphemers, who were to me only carriers of the general guilt, which gives much food for thought. End quote. What's going on here in Nietzsche's thought process? As Klossowski puts it, quote, "In his phantasm, Nietzsche saw the marvels of the Louvre in flames," end quote. That's really what Nietzsche is getting at here, and this letter might call to mind Nietzsche's essay from just a short while later on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, where he imagines that the entire intellectual and conscious history of humankind is this precarious thing, simply some clever animals who invented knowledge, who will be wiped out one day, whenever the day comes in the future that our star grows cold, that the whole collective accomplishments of human culture indeed appear absurd, and that they're so fragile and precarious. Whole periods of art, whole centuries of striving and achievement could easily be destroyed on the whims of some deranged anarchists in a single afternoon. We may note that Nietzsche's use of the term the combat against culture is somewhat ironic in light of the fact that he would later produce a series of cultural criticisms in his untimely meditations, and that Nietzsche's work can therefore be seen as itself a combat against culture. But this is why his meditations in this letter on guilt, the shared guilt, are so important. We are all, he says, carriers of a general guilt. Nietzsche can't simply blame the communards. He takes the guilt upon himself, we might say, the entirety of modern-day Europe. And why would that be? Well, Klossowski writes, quote, "The reproduction of the world of the affects through art has been possible only thanks to this historical and cultural world constructed by the servile consciousness." End quote. Klossowski spends some time drawing on the Hegelian master-slave dialectic at this point in the text, which I'm going to skip over because I think, for one, I don't fully agree with him, but also I don't think it's that important. The really important point for Nietzsche is that the values of consciousness are necessarily correlated with these values of servility, which always refer back to the security and the well-being of the greatest many. These values which seek to turn every human being, every individual, into a function or an instrument of the whole. That is what the main goal of rationality itself has proven to be in any case. Again, thinking of utilitarianism and all of these modern ideas, and it seemed to Nietzsche that the inevitable goal was therefore to eventually do away with all asymmetries of power. Like if we follow these Enlightenment ideas to their ultimate conclusions. And thus, but what would actually happen if we did that, right? We would claim to liberate all human beings, but simultaneously enslave them all equally, right? No more masters, but all become slaves of the general will, of the collective moral injunctions. No man is above the law, as we like to say. We're all servants of the commonwealth. There's dignity in labor, and we must all labor, and so on. And so, in seeking to do away with that asymmetry, modern culture condemns worldly injustices. But this is a huge problem because culture itself is situated atop a foundation of injustices. As Nietzsche writes in the unpublished fragmentary essay entitled The Greek State, around the time he wrote this letter to von Gersdorff, he writes, quote, that slavery belongs to the essence of a culture is a truth that leaves no doubt as to the absolute value of existence. For the Promethean investigator of culture, it is the vulture that gnaws at the liver, end quote. So all art, all those cultural productions contained in the Louvre, are the work of a class of people who were, for the most part, freed from the obligation to labor. Well, you can only devote your time and energy to make the Mona Lisa if you're freed from the duty to sow and harvest crops in the fields all day as a feudal subject. Which means that the productions of culture are themselves the product of a kind of parasitism, which is a theme Nietzsche would spin out over his career. Klossowski writes, quote, a lived culture, according to Nietzsche, can never have a gregarious foundation. It is the fact of the particular case, and thus from the viewpoint of the bourgeois concept of culture, a monstrosity, end quote. So this is one of those confoundings of unequal things under this label of culture that Nietzsche has uncovered here. So in modernity, especially after the French Revolution, we begin to embrace this new concept of culture, which is universalist and egalitarian. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. From that standpoint, the universalist and humanist standpoint that comes out of the Enlightenment, the kind of culture that exists only for a limited sphere and parasitizes off of the majority is fundamentally immoral. Which means the modern conception of culture must attack its own foundations, which are the actual origin of culture. This self-undermining is, for Nietzsche, almost self-undermining, you could say, is like sickness in itself. And ultimately, Nietzsche predicts this will eventually create something like an anti-culture, where all have their utilitarian needs met, but art more or less becomes a thing of the past. Creativity and passion, especially leisure time, all of these things become increasingly minimized and marginalized. The affects become exchangeable quantities, to be what we might say the passions, right? They become exchangeable quantities to be manipulated for the purposes of economic consumption. And so, in light of this, the communards are not to blame because they are simply acting out the leveling impulse which attacks the foundations of culture in the name of ending social misery, as Nietzsche puts it. And that type of judgment laces the entirety of modern thought. And so, somewhat ironically, Nietzsche will then launch his own combat against culture, not against the old concept of culture, but against the universalizing, egalitarian, bourgeois culture. But this is where Klossowski departs from his reading of Nietzsche's philosophy through this attempt to decipher his doctrines. Again, as we would say, maybe perhaps the usual way of reading philosophy. Because having laid all of this out, Nietzsche's new project of determining health from sickness, determining the singular case from the gregarious, assessing the direction of culture and diagnosing its ailments, and so on and so forth. Now, he turns about to consider these same philosophical positions from the standpoint that it is a semiology of Nietzsche's moods, his affects. And thus, Nietzsche's combat against culture is a reflection of his physiology. Klossowski writes, quote, the euphoria that gripped Nietzsche after each of his crises from 1877 to 1881 led him to scrutinize ever more carefully the forces that had been revealed through the disturbances of his organism. A series was thereby formed, a group of reflections on certain aspects of history, on certain arguments of scientists or thinkers or artists, on certain gestures of politicians, all of which, depending on the diverse level they represented, seemed to bear witness, actively or passively, to the same forces that had just given Nietzsche's brain, his organism, a short respite. The anger, tenderness, impatience, or calm he experienced in the context of certain motives and circumstances were already sanctioned by received terms. Yet the afflux or reflux of these forces, their tension or relaxation, could find an apparent outlet only by being translated into words, images, reasonings, or refutations. For a moment arrived when they would again become muddled, intermingling and obscuring one another. They had been diverted, they had deviated far from an aim, and neither history nor science nor investigation nor even the forms of art converged upon this aim." End quote. So we can regard these thoughts of Nietzsche's as a series of signifiers, which can reveal something to us about him, the thinker, the man. And further, we can see his comments on culture or certain arguments given by scientists or thinkers or artists or gestures of politicians. They can bear witness to the same forces that had given Nietzsche's brain his various states. So, in a way, this is the way of reading Nietzsche's philosophy, the same way we would read a piece of music as a semiology of the affects. We can read all of Nietzsche's comments on philosophy, history, art, science, and so on, as a series of signifiers about his affects. And Klossowski will focus on the alternations of lucidity and unconsciousness in Nietzsche's thought. The fact that his consciousness, his capacity for thought, seemed to almost dissolve and then recoalesce. We could consider how Nietzsche himself understood this rhythm. Thoughts, and therefore words, all linguistic communications, are the conscious representation of a fluctuating inner state. Quote, "Consciousness itself constitutes the code of signs that inverts, falsifies, and filters what is expressed through the body." End quote. So the impulses speak through the philosopher, and we know those impulses through the code of signs. That's how impulses appear. Without those signs, they wouldn't be experienced at all. They wouldn't come into our awareness at all. So how do Nietzsche's states appear to him? What's signified by his valetudinary states as regards the relationship of thought to impulse? And Klossowski draws upon a number of letters to make a very unusual but interesting case as regards this, and we'll look at some of those letters or just some brief excerpts from them. In a letter to Peter Gast in 1879, Nietzsche writes of his convalescence from a recent bout of illness, quote, "You would not believe with what fidelity I have carried out the program of thoughtlessness so far. I have reasons for fidelity here, for behind thought stands the devil of a tormenting attack of pain." End quote. He continues by noting that in the interim, between writing down thoughts, quote, "the connections between the thoughts escape my memory. I have to steal the minutes and quarter hours of brain energy, as you call it, steal them away from a suffering brain." End quote. In another letter, this time to Malvida von Meisenbug, Nietzsche describes himself as a martyr, and he says that his suffering could match that of an ascetic from any time period. He longs for the stroke that will liberate him, and he says he hopes it will not be too distant. And I think he means like the stroke of fate, not a literal stroke, although it's quite possible that it actually was a stroke that liberated him, quote unquote. But Nietzsche writes, quote, "I have wrung from these years much in the way of purification and burnishing of the soul, and I no longer need religion or art as a means to that end. Complete isolation alone enabled me to discover my own resources of self-help. I have poured out a drop of good oil for many, and I have given to many an indication of how to rise above themselves, how to attain equanimity and a right mind. No pain has been, or should be, able to make me bear false witness about life as I know it to be." End quote. There's also this letter to Dr. Iser, quote, "My existence is a dreadful burden. I would have rejected it long ago had I not been making the most instructive experiments in the intellectual and moral domain in just this condition of suffering and almost complete renunciation. This joyous mood, avid for knowledge, raised me to heights where I triumphed over every torture and all despair." End quote. Finally, we'll look at one more letter to Franz Overbeck, in which Nietzsche says his daily struggles with his migraines put him in danger of becoming petty. But the counterweight to this are, quote, "the very lofty impulses which have such control over me that without that counterweight, I would make a fool of myself." End quote. So what are we to make of all this? I mean, it seems that Nietzsche, of all people, considered his intellectual activity to be a burden. In fact, he considers thinking itself to be a burden in some of these letters. If he is to speak of himself as a martyr, then his crucifix must be his own thought, the thought that goes on in his suffering brain. And in the periods when his migraines attacked him so strongly that he couldn't think any longer, he experiences this as a kind of liberation from that suffering. And during his attempts to recover from bouts of illness, he describes this ascetic, Spartan lifestyle. And during this, thinking of any kind is almost impossible. And so the reason why I say that Klossowski's analysis is so unusual is that it's usually portrayed in the opposite manner, that Nietzsche's body is the thing that was the burden, that it was Nietzsche's body attacking him. Because after all, it's like the physiological pain. That's like the real thing that he's struggling with. Migraines, stomach pains, all of these things. And so he finds refuge from the excruciating physiological pain in his philosophy, in the world of thought, which can be looked at then as a sort of ironic thing because Nietzsche's philosophy sort of exalts the physiology over conscious thought. But Klossowski's unusual take, I think it gains its appeal from precisely that point. He suggests that Nietzsche's thinking itself was a kind of pain, a kind of mental suffering, and the attacks of his body, so-called, were a liberation from this pain. Klossowski writes, quote, "The act of thinking became identical with suffering and suffering with thinking. From this fact, Nietzsche posited the coincidence of thought with suffering and asked what a thought would be that was deprived of suffering. Thinking suffering, reflecting on past suffering as the impossibility of thinking, then came to be experienced by Nietzsche as the highest joy. But does thought really have the power to actualize itself without suffering, without reconstituting its own suffering? Does thought itself suffer from its own inability to actualize itself? What then is doing the suffering or enjoying? The brain? Can the cerebral organ enjoy the suffering of the body of which it is a function? Can the body rejoice in the suffering of the supreme organ?" End quote. So let's disentangle this a bit. Thinking suffering as the impossibility of thinking. So what this means is that when Nietzsche reflects on his past suffering as the thing that interrupts his thought, when he has the thought that suffering can overcome thinking, suffering can overcome thinking itself, and this is a thinkable thought, he takes joy in that, which is an incredibly strange prospect. Joy as suffering, but when it is divorced from thought. Thought as canceled by suffering, rather than thought as coterminous with suffering, or equal to suffering. And this in itself is this cancellation of thought by suffering as a paradoxical kind of joy. It's almost hard to imagine. And Klossowski then quotes Lou Salome, quote, "It was when Nietzsche felt most healthy and most robust in complete control of his creative powers that he came closest to his illness. And it was the forced rest and idleness that would again allow him to recover and to keep the catastrophe in suspense." End quote. What was this catastrophe? Well, obviously, Lou Salome is writing with a bit of a retrospective eye, we might say, because the catastrophe is Nietzsche's eventual mental collapse into permanent insanity. So Salome's claim, and Klossowski's for that matter, is that Nietzsche's illness actually staved off his eventual mental collapse rather than brought it on. And for the record, I don't believe this at all. I think that they have the causal relationship inverted here. I think that Nietzsche's eventual insanity was the result of his physiological illness. That's probably my strongest point of disagreement with Klossowski is the sort of the relation, the causal relation between his philosophy and his eventual collapse that I don't really agree with. But in a way, it's not actually as important that we determine how that causal relationship worked, because what Klossowski is talking about is how Nietzsche experienced his thought and how he experienced the relationship of his body, his physiology, to his thought, his psychology, and then how that experience became inverted into the signs communicated by his philosophy. So the argument is then that Nietzsche interprets the body as a locus of active forces, trying to break with the servitude imposed upon them by the brain. This is, in other words, the servility of consciousness, as Nietzsche saw it. The impulses, the body, are rebelling against Nietzsche's consciousness. But that dissolution of the self, that comes inevitably with the dissolution of thought, is only a dissolution from the point of view of the brain, we might say. It's a dissolution of the moral person, the rational actor, or we might say the self-image that we think is created out of our intentions. And so Nietzsche experiences this conflict within himself between brain and body and sides with the active forces in the body. Klossowski calls it a war of the somatic versus the spiritual. We might say a war of the unconscious versus the conscious. And thus, Nietzsche wishes to destroy, quote unquote, the person in favor of the nervous system, of which he is the proud possessor. And eventually he will redefine the self to be, in so many words, basically that very nervous system, the confluence of drives, this locus of sensation and impulse, rather than the ego consciousness, the conceptualization of all of this. So he will attempt to steal the designation of self from the ego. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that this break with servitude must also pass through the brain, because our inner world is represented in the conscious world by the code of signs, i.e., the thoughts, the words, and images. And so what does Nietzsche do? Klossowski argues that he creates a mode of intelligence answerable only to physical criteria. He reinterprets the consciousness from the perspective of the somatic, and in this reinterpretation, neither suffering nor pleasure can any longer be interpreted as an end. Suffering instead becomes a means to an end. From the point of view of the organism, the body, suffering or pleasure are instruments. They're means of prodding the organism to push it in one direction or another. Suffering, therefore, is in fact a kind of energy. It's something that can be used to produce results. It's not itself a mode of evaluation for the worth of life. And as a brief aside, Klossowski thinks that this reinterpretation of the impulses helps to account for the periodicity of Nietzsche's thought, at least to some extent. So, for example, Nietzsche's early Hellenism. Nietzsche takes the side of the somatic against the spiritual, and therefore the Greeks can be seen as a somatic culture in contrast with our modern spiritual culture, quote unquote. To put it into maybe a bit clearer terms, today we're intellectualizing and the theoretical, and the Greeks are driven by impulse. At least that's in Nietzsche's presentation of the Greeks. And so we can see how there's sort of that signification that's happening in the war between the Hellenistic world and the modern world in Nietzsche's work. And so Klossowski writes that Nietzsche's Hellenism is part of a search for, quote, a culture that would accord with the forces of the unspoken, end quote. Now, this type of outlook, I think, might prompt some of us to return to that paradox at the center of Nietzsche's thought and ask, how does Nietzsche intend to take up for the side of the somatic? Because Nietzsche doesn't really believe that there's a way of hygiene or fitness that can be grasped by reason and then applied to the body as a kind of rational regime. The body is a chaos. It's a flux and reflux of impulses, and importantly, it's a product of utter chance. And so Nietzsche stands in opposition to, for example, the Stoics. They believe that you could confront the passions with a rational regime, but Nietzsche doesn't believe that he can aid the passions with a rational regime either. So again, what is Nietzsche doing here in taking up for unconsciousness against the consciousness? And this leads to one of the most insightful sections of Klossowski's work, where he interprets Nietzsche's understanding of the relation between the consciousness and the unconsciousness. Consciousness inverts the, quote, messages transmitted by the impulses, end quote, by reversing the origin and the destination, or the means and the ends, as in the way the conscious subject thinks of its operations is along the lines of, I have an intention and I tell my body what to do. But Nietzsche says actually a particularly intense impulse tells my brain what to do, that the intensity of the impulse is inverted by the brain into its own intentions. So then we would have to ask, why would consciousness create this illusion of selfhood, of rational control, of intentionality as a governing force? Klossowski argues that it's because the brain is the most fragile organ. It comes to dominate the body because of its very fragility. It creates the homonym of the person who has a body, quote unquote, because the cerebral organ is the most vulnerable organ, the one that the body has to guard most jealously, we might say. That's the reason for the upright position of the body and therefore the equivocation of the mind with the self. Why is the brain valuable then if conscious control is an illusion? Because the brain is the organ that imposes a cohesion on the body. It fights against any force that would decohere the self. And that's very important to consider in light of Nietzsche's war of the spiritual versus the somatic and his feeling that his body's attempting to dissolve his consciousness. He's taking up for the decohesion, you might say. But the brain, as an organ like all other organs, like all of the physiology, is itself formed by impulses. It's very important to remember that as well. And that means that the impulses themselves have created their own supreme obstacle, the brain. And so, again, we just produce more and more questions as we go down this path. Why this antagonistic relationship in the first place? Or we might say, if not antagonistic, perhaps adversarial. Nietzsche writes, quote, error begins in the organic world, end quote. The organic is the exception in a largely inorganic universe. The organic world is different from the inorganic in that, quote, exchange and assimilation are necessary, end quote. And here we mean nourishment, reproduction, mutation, all these chemical organic processes by which life transforms itself by appropriating what is external to it and incorporating it and bringing it into the body, and then giving rise to new forms by way of exchange, at least, when it comes to sexual production, the exchange of genetic material. All exchange, however, requires interpretation, which means misunderstanding becomes possible. This can be seen in the fact that the organism has to determine what it will eat. Some things might appear as nourishment, but could actually be detrimental to the organism. Some choices of a sexual partner for mating might be better than others. So the impulses or the drives, they're like the organic forces in every way, except that the impulses have to interpret. In the world of inorganic forces, this is not true. There is no misunderstanding between strong and weak in the world of inorganic forces, in the world of physics. As Klossowski says, persuasion happens automatically in the inorganic world. So perhaps as an example, if an object with sufficient mass and speed strikes another object, the struck object will break. There's no interpretation required between these forces. Strength and weakness are determined without interpretation. But in the organic world, there's trial and error. There's the necessity to move from ignorance to certainty. And so, in other words, there's a necessity for experimentation. The brain itself is the product of this process that seeks to reduce error in interpretations. How can it do this? By avoiding blind chance, and thus by working towards, again, cohesion. That which survives has to believe in its own necessity. It has to therefore interpret what is helpful or harmful to it, what's helpful to assimilate into itself, for example, what's harmful to take into the self. And so impulse and repulsion is a code that's developed from the bottom to the top of organic life. And so our conscious representations of the world comes out of this interpreting organ whose job it is to reduce error. These are sort of at the we might say the top, most complex level, right? What are these representations? Well, as Nietzsche says in his lectures on rhetoric of all places, quote, "Man who forms language does not perceive things or events, but impulses. He does not communicate sensations, but merely copies of sensations. The sensation evoked through a nerve impulse does not take in the thing itself. This sensation is presented externally through an image." End quote. As Klossowski puts it, an excitable state, a particularly intense impulse, produces a phantasm, a representation of what has taken place or what could have taken place. So excitation of an impulse creates this image of the excitation, which impulses or repulses, which draws us forward towards the image, the phantasm, if it's interpreted positively, or draws us away from the image if it's interpreted negatively. And understanding what's being argued here, I think, is as simple as saying that when you desire something and you imagine what it's going to be like when you get that, whatever the object of the desire is. We'll use a wholesome example. Let's say your grandparents like to dote on you and you're a little kid and your parents say, "We're going to grandma's house." And, based on the past excitations, the past sensations you've had when, you've been doted on by your grandparents, you get excited because you remember those images come before your mind and you begin to imagine the place that you're going. Or, this could also be, a negative. When people have trauma, they produce perhaps a negative phantasm. So, if you get in a really bad car wreck, perhaps when you find yourself in conditions, maybe it was raining and you find yourself in the same conditions in the same highway and you have a flashback to that traumatic experience of the car accident, suddenly that re-stimulates some of the same impulses, the same feelings, the same moods that you had in that previous encounter situation. And so this flux of differing impulses and the relations between them in terms of their relative power, this all determines how the image is modified. So there are traces in us of past excitations that comprise the basis of the code. The unconscious presumably has its own code, according to Klossowski, but we can know nothing of it. What we know is the conscious rarefactions of the impulsive code. But as Nietzsche says in that excerpt that we just looked at from his lectures on rhetoric, we then abbreviate these signs. Quote, "They are invented in a sphere where the true and the false necessitates the erroneous representation that something can endure and remain identical." End quote. So in other words, we don't reproduce the impulse itself. We don't transmit our impulses directly to other people. We discharge a sound, we speak words, and those conjure these images, these phantasms. And so we're several degrees of removal away from the direct experience of the impulse. But in doing this, in establishing this conscious code of communication, you create this potential for misinterpretation insofar as you can make the error that the image, which seems to endure across these fleeting impulses, is indeed something that persists. And so again, to follow the argument, Nietzsche thinks that what we actually experience in life is just a series of states brought on by the rising and falling intensities of impulse. As he says in the time atom fragment, all that's given to us, all that we have, is sensation and representation. And he thinks that the basis of this is intensity of impulse. But the impulses are experienced as signs or symptoms. The brain invents words or concepts that are abbreviations of the signs. So the brain doesn't abbreviate the actual impulse because it doesn't directly experience it, so to speak. First, it launders the impulse into the sign, and then it freezes it into place as a unity in the form of the word concept. And so Nietzsche insists that the consciousness is not a thing. It's a post hoc narrative. It's an interpretation, we might say, the interpretation of the body by its cerebral organ. Its aim is the coherence of the organism, and so it imposes that false identity on the impulses. It conflates them into a single subject with a coherent, persistent existence. And the argument is not that we have an illusory experience of a coherent existence. It's actually that we don't even experience a continuity. And that's a very radical claim, but I think Klossowski, through Nietzsche, makes a very compelling argument. But we can't point to any experience of the continuity of the self. That is to say that The continuity only exists as an interpretation, not as a phenomenon. The continuity is an interpretation of past events, of memories. But there's always only the immediate moment. And what do these moments consist of? What is the actual content? A series of discontinuous states. That's what we call consciousness. What we call unconsciousness is the breaks between these flickering memories of consciousness, sleep or forgetfulness and so on. And thus we can't really say anything about unconsciousness. You can say we experience the unconsciousness by inference from the conscious signs, the after effects, the traces, the inversions of impulse, and so on. But that's what our conscious life already is. Such an interpretation gets us no closer to the unconsciousness. And so I think perhaps the most important thing to understand here is that this dichotomy between consciousness and unconsciousness is false from the very beginning. Klossowski writes, quote, "Neither consciousness, nor unconsciousness, nor willing or non-willing have ever existed. Within a system of designating fluctuations, there is only a discontinuity between silence and declarations in the agent." End quote. If we're going to say that thought is unconscious in origin, that thought is the objectivation of an impulse, then by what right can we make that division between the unconscious origin and the conscious objectivation, when in fact all we have is the conscious objectivation? The unconscious is only known through signs, which means we never experience it. By definition, whatever remains purely unconscious would never come to the surface in the form of a sign. But all the signs, the conscious world of thoughts, are in actuality, according to Nietzsche, just impulses in a conscious form. So consciousness is like, I really like the analogy he uses, it's like a mirror reflection of these chance states. It's a kind of cerebral activity that had to very slowly and steadily detach itself from sleep or from the dreaming state. The waking state of consciousness is inseparable from forgetfulness, just as, he says, the reflective surface of the mirror is inseparable from the tane, the solid backing of the mirror. Quote, "But once it scratches the tane, consciousness itself, in its very transparency, merges with the flux and reflux of the impulses." End quote. So whenever the mind penetrates into the unconscious world of the impulses, all that ends up happening is that it merges with the flux. It loses its intelligibility. It loses its waking state. That's what it would mean. It would be to forget all the representations that it normally mirrors. So what is the basis for making this distinction at all? Either the impulses speak or they don't. And that's all we really have, is a series of discontinuous states interrupted by silence. So again, because a lot of this is really dense, so I want to recapitulate the argument again. The designating fluctuations are impulses that interpret and designate. They create forms or phantasms as a code for themselves. They're either present or they're not. What we experience is a discontinuity in between moments of silence. We don't actually experience, quote-unquote, consciousness or, quote-unquote, unconsciousness, at least not in the way that we think that we do. Consciousness is a flickering memory. Unconsciousness is never experienced, because once it's brought into the experience, it becomes conscious. It becomes part of that code of signs. And yet Nietzsche still places the consciousness as a tool of the unconsciousness. We might remember that, the war of the somatic versus the spiritual. He uses these terms, conscious and unconscious, and he claims that the consciousness has been erroneously valued above the impulses, when in fact it should be the other way around. But why? I mean, if consciousness and unconsciousness are both false ideas, a false dichotomy, what is Nietzsche actually talking about then in Klossowski's understanding? I think this paradox arises if you make certain assumptions about the function of language, which happen to be the same assumptions created by the conscious apparatus in order to justify itself, which of course they would be. But those assumptions are that we're using language to solve problems or even reshape reality, the logos idea. But Klossowski has a simple and brilliant way of sort of cutting the Gordian knot here and sort of reframing our understanding of what language is doing, or Nietzsche's understanding, rather, of what he was doing with language when he was disparaging the consciousness in favor of the unconscious. Nietzsche uses these terms, Klossowski argues, to employ the, quote, valorization of language. And we could recall what Peter Sloterdijk argues in his work Nietzsche Apostle, that language does not exist simply to communicate states of affairs, but to incorporate states of affairs into a glory. Those who speak the same language, as Sloterdijk puts it, vibrate in a kind of redundancy with one another. And this is actually, in his view, the primary function of language over and above any communicative function. Language, in other words, it's a kind of self-celebration contained in the code of everyday signs. As Klossowski puts it, there's a celebration of the gregarious morality, of the servile nature of consciousness, the badness or the evil of the impulses. And so in seizing this power of the valorization of language, the celebratory aspect of language, which again, that's rather than using language as logos, a reshaping of the world, Nietzsche gives us a language for the valorization of the unconscious. He's using the code of everyday signs to undermine the values of that code. Because within that code, we've come to associate the consciousness with what is intentional, and that which we are therefore responsible for. That's really the key point. Whereas whatever we do unconsciously, without intention, is seen within the code of everyday signs as irresponsible. And responsibility is the core of morality. And, to bring this circle back to some of the considerations at the beginning, what is morality? In this understanding, it's a rigidification of certain impulses, certain intensities into rules once and for all. It's the exclusion of the special case and the adoption of a universal set of prescriptions. Well, morality is at the foundation of every inquiry, including Nietzsche's. And we might refer to his comments in Beyond Good and Evil on the ethos of the will to truth, that his goal is to follow the will to truth to the ends that no one has followed it to before. Take it through to its ultimate conclusions, and he will therefore use that will to truth to destroy its own foundations, just as he'll use morality to destroy its foundations. He employs the valorization of language, therefore, in the name of irresponsibility. That's what he's hoping to glorify, in a sense. Klossowski writes, quote, Nietzsche knew that meaning and goal are mere fictions, as are the ego, identity, duration, and willing. It was nonetheless through these same designations that he agreed to speak in favor of an end. What was the point of denouncing consciousness as an aim that had hitherto been erroneous, inasmuch as it had usurped the authentic state of existence, making us pessimistic toward it? Even though language is the usurper, it never allows us to speak of our unintelligible depth, except by ascribing to it what is neither thought nor said nor willed, a meaning and an aim that we think according to language. Means and end still remain within the perspective of consciousness. To use conscious categories as a means to attain an end outside of consciousness is still to remain subordinate to the false perspective of consciousness. A consciousness that would be conscious of being an instrument of chaos would no longer be capable of obeying the aim of a chaos that would not even ask it to pursue such an aim. Chaos, in turn, would then be conscious and would no longer be chaos. The terms conscious and unconscious are therefore applicable to nothing that is real. If Nietzsche made use of them, it was only as a psychological convention. End quote. And so Klossowski argues that in doing this, Nietzsche creates a new cohesion beyond the conscious agent. The conscious agent was the previous cohesion sought by the consciousness. Nietzsche's new cohesion is instead a state of tension between the fortuitous agent, which is really the body as the consciousness perceives it, the consciousness being the tool of the body, and the incoherence of chaos, which is the fluctuating, discontinuous states of which nothing can be said of their code because it's beyond the consciousness. Quote, the combat that wills to maintain itself, end quote. And so this tension, this combat between the impulses on the one side and the obstacle, reason or consciousness, becomes the new self. And so Nietzsche's view of the body and the impulses and their relation to consciousness still has to use the ordinary signs, employ some of the logic that it calls false. But he's able to conclude through this inquiry that there is no intention other than the intense impulses which are, quote, assigned to the will by consciousness, end quote. As Klossowski puts it, quote, an aim is merely an image provoked by active forces which are experienced and codified as intentions, end quote. So what we call an intention is simply an intensity, And the intention, as Nietzsche will write in Beyond Good and Evil, is something that is merely on the surface. Just like the skins on our bodies, it shows something while concealing much, much more. And one of the dangerous notions he raises in that passage is that while we have previously evaluated actions according to what is intentional in them, perhaps in the future, the value of one's actions might be correlated with what is, or it might be judged or evaluated according to what is unintentional in it. And that's what that's his extra moral age beyond the moral age. That's what he hopes for as part of this destruction of responsibility, frankly. But there's something unsettling about this, because when described in this way, the determinism of the system, the organism, the irreversibility of it, it seems to, quote, reduce the human being to the status of an automaton, end quote. Because again, all of this language of unintentionality, irresponsibility, unfreedom of the will would seem to reduce the human being to a mere spectator. Sure, he can say, my body is the true active force, but that leaves nothing for the consciousness. And how is such a system of thought supposed to function, quote unquote, given that it's conveyed through the consciousness? This view of mankind as an automaton, that view obtains during yet another period in Nietzsche's thought that follows his Hellenizing period, which was defined by Birth of Tragedy. This is his middle period, starting with Human All Too Human, during which Nietzsche's thought has been described as positivist or even bordering on mechanistic. And I would agree with that. This is before Nietzsche really challenges the doctrines of cause and effect. And so, having not made that critique yet, having not arrived there, Nietzsche first makes his attempt to overthrow the consciousness by seeing it as a product of causes, you might say. The hope during this period is that by freeing the consciousness from the constraints of morality, perhaps we could achieve a new creativity or a new spontaneity in some sort of paradoxical way. Quote, to recover an authentic spontaneity, the producer of these categories, the intellectual organ, must in turn be treated as a simple automaton, a pure tool. By consequence, as a spectator of itself, the automaton finds its freedom only in the spectacle that moves from intensity to intention, from the latter to intensity. End quote. And elsewhere, Klossowski continues, quote, whence the liberatory statement, one can reconstruct the living being in conformity with these same forces, thereby restoring an impulsive spontaneity to it. End quote. So by bringing this idea into the consciousness, that the unconscious is actually what is active, we can create a new freedom by allowing the consciousness to feel it's no longer bound by reason and morality and intentionality. You can't really destroy the abbreviations of signs, the everyday code. You can't replace it with the signs themselves, for whatever that would mean, because these remain essentially incommunicable. The signs themselves are our own inner states, our experiences, the tonalities of our soul, the unconsciousness as it is felt by us. In order to make these communicable, they have to become part of the code. So instead, Nietzsche translates the conscious semiotic into the semiotic of the impulses. But Klossowski argues, quote, Nietzsche clearly foresaw that such a lucidity, if it ever managed to prevail, would institute such a new conformity that he finally turned away from it in derision, end quote. So if we were ever to become lucid of the fact that the consciousness is governed by automatism, that the consciousness is impotent, that we're mere spectators of our lives, would this not serve to actually deprive mankind of drive and will? And this raises the question as to how this deprivation of consciousness of its traditional powers and importance could ever become, we might say, like decisively liberatory and not simply reduce the subject to a spectator. Where does the new spontaneity come from exactly? How can I affirm myself? How can I will my own fate if the will itself is just a confluence of these forces, these drives, these accidents of accidents? Upon what kind of thought could I base that affirmation? And this, in Klossowski's view, is the role of the eternal return, what Nietzsche would have seen as its transformative effect on the subject. And one of the enduring questions that this raises, it's another paradox. I feel like we keep taking the paradoxes to just higher and higher levels and without ever really resolving it. But it's something that should be with you and that I think is worth thinking about as we move forward in examining this work in the subsequent episodes. Whether or not the eternal return really produces such a transformative effect, or whether or not The eternal return itself is just another inversion of Nietzsche's moods into philosophy. And to cut to the chase, that's precisely what Klossowski thinks it is. In any case, the idea of the eternal return marks the beginning of Nietzsche's mature philosophy, which supersedes his positivist period. Nietzsche considered the eternal return to be his most profound thought, and it's at the center of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he considered his most important work. And by adopting the eternal return as the central thought of his work, Nietzsche moves from this positivist phase into what might be called his affirmative phase. But again, Klossowski sees the eternal return very differently than almost any other interpreter I've read. And perhaps the first thing to point out about his interpretation of it is that the eternal return, quote, suppresses every goal and meaning, since the beginning and the end always merge with each other, end quote. In the cyclical structure of time which is presented in the eternal return, there is no beginning and no end to anything, because at every single moment you can only say that you're at one position in a repeating circuit, and that you will eventually return to that same position. And so to speak of a goal for existence becomes nonsensical. To speak of a meaning of existence also becomes nonsensical. And Nietzsche says this explicitly in the final note as it's compiled in Will to Power, quote, "This, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying, this mystery world of the twofold voluptuous delight, my beyond good and evil, without goal unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will unless a ring feels goodwill toward itself," end quote. The eternal return, which Klossowski refers to as the sign of the vicious circle, has many, many dimensions to it in relation to this semiotic of impulses and the whole story of the imposition of this false coherence and the overthrow of consciousness. But we can see even here at the beginning of these considerations how the eternal return helps Nietzsche to break free from this view of human life through automatism. Because just as beginning and end become meaningless in the eternal return in a structure of time that repeats infinitely and incessantly, so too do cause and effect. Far from being an automaton whose actions are effects that happen according to mechanistic causes, man can only be a series of discontinuous states. Because the whole notion of cause and effect has dissolved because there's no first cause. The circle completely makes nonsense of the whole idea of cause and effect. So we're just a series of discontinuous states. We're effectively different quote-unquote subjects which are forgotten and remembered in an infinite, ever-repeating series. Forgetfulness is such a key part of the eternal return, isn't it? And Klossowski really draws on that. So it's a different picture of life. Man is not a helpless consciousness bound in the chains of causality, forced to walk along a mechanistic path. In fact, there's no continuity to the consciousness at all. There's no cause and effect. There's only the discontinuity. As Klossowski will argue in the third chapter on the eternal return, believing the eternal return necessitates the belief that you have forgotten yourself, and upon realizing the eternal return, you have to posit that you've both lived the same life an infinite number of times, but that you've always forgotten it. You have no memory of these relivings. In fact, as Klossowski will argue, if one actually remembered reliving their life in some fashion or another, this would actually be at odds with the doctrine of eternal return. And in any case, it's not even clear to me what that would even mean, to remember having lived your exact self-same life an infinite number of times. It would be an infinity of the exact self-same memories, so they would just be copies of the same thing. But in any case, Nietzsche's high moment, his realization of the eternal return, his thought, as he said, 6,000 feet above man and time, was precisely the transformative aspect of this thought. That in fact, we do not remember any of this. We don't have a memory of having lived infinite lives. The realization of the eternal return is significant because of the fact that we have forgotten this truth. The significance for Nietzsche is that this thought could make you, as he says, other than you are now, if you were to incorporate it into yourself. He says in the passage The Greatest Weight in The Gay Science, quote, "If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you," end quote. Now, of course, is the eternal return a truth? Well, we're going to get into that in much more detail next week. Klossowski would say that, again, following Nietzsche's own philosophical method, the eternal return is, in essence, not even a doctrine. It's a high tonality of the soul. It's a high feeling that Nietzsche had, and he then attempted to transform it into a sign. Nietzsche takes the traces of this high experience, of the realization of the return, and he spends the rest of his career at various points trying to re-communicate it. And oftentimes, as he attempted to do so, the emotional tonality of the thought seems to have been very different than the emotional tonality that gave birth to the thought. So while the eternal return was experienced as the highest joy for Nietzsche, many of Nietzsche's friends, when he tried to communicate the thought to them, said that Nietzsche almost appeared to be disturbed by the notion, as if he were communicating something terrifying or melancholy. And that in and of itself is rather interesting, and again, that'll be a subject for a future episode in this series on the vicious circle. But this is the brilliance of Klossowski's work, in that he ties the eternal return to this other core aspect of Nietzsche's thought, the impulses as the true quote-unquote subject of consciousness, which is a connection that other interpreters, I think, had not really made, that the vicious circle, the eternal return, springs out of these valetudinary states of Nietzsche's, insofar as he would experience himself, i.e. Nietzsche, as the conscious thinking agent, as something that would rise and fall, dissolve and coalesce, afflux and reflux, or we might say as a subject that forgets himself and then remembers himself again, who thinks and then has his thought interrupted, who is lucid and then unconscious. And that is precisely what the eternal return signifies, a circuit upon which the consciousness is a series of disunited states, an oscillation of intensities that loses itself and gains hold of itself. The moment of gaining hold of oneself in this new language is precisely the moment when the self realizes the eternal return and wills the eternal return. This getting hold of oneself is not a coherence imposed on reality conceptually through these false unities contained in the word concepts. Rather, it's getting hold of oneself through affirming or willing oneself. But what is quote-unquote oneself other than the circuit, other than the vicious circle? And this is the amorphity, the shift in perspective from the consciousness being merely an irreversible thing, the product of mechanistic fate, to being a fortuitous thing. The body is the chance occurrence that one nevertheless wills to be, and therefore affirms. And therefore, through this affirmation, you seize an identity out of that discontinuity. And at the same time, by seeing that identity as merely one state among a series of discontinuous states on a circuit, you simultaneously affirm a self which is non-identical to itself. And again, so this then links us back to Nietzsche establishing the coherence of the self by a new tension, right? The self is now that productive tension between the impulses and the consciousness rather than solely being located in the consciousness. And we might also think of his famous dictum, become who you are, or that life says, I am that which overcomes itself. There's something essentially, what might we say? There's something about the self which contains things which are non-identical in the same, disunity, we might say. As such, Klossowski concludes his chapter on the semiology of impulses as follows, quote, "We cannot renounce language, nor our intentions, nor our willing, but we could evaluate this willing and these intentions in a different manner than we have hitherto evaluated them, namely as subject to the law of the vicious circle. Moreover, the doctrine of the vicious circle, which is a sign of forgetfulness, is grounded in the forgetfulness of what we have been and will be, not only for innumerable times, but for all time and always. We are other than what we are now, others that are not elsewhere, but always in this same life." Now, for Nietzsche is not lucidity, which means the thought of a total discordance between the hidden reality and the one that is claimed or admitted, the opposite of life? Is it not the inertia of power? Is it not precisely the non-true, the error that permits the human species to survive? Does not the unconsciousness of this physiological conditioning correspond to certain indispensable conditions of existence for this animal species? Is this not what Nietzsche has been ceaselessly affirming? However, had he not stated with equal force that the only way we can overcome our servitude is by knowing that we are not free, That as pure mechanisms, pure automatons, we gain spontaneity by knowing this. On the one hand, forgetfulness and unconsciousness are necessary to life. On the other hand, there is a will to unconsciousness, which precisely because it is willed implies the consciousness of our conditioned state, an irresoluble antinomy. Now, and Klossowski quotes Nietzsche at the end of this passage, quote, life itself created this grave thought of the eternal return. Life wants to overcome its supreme obstacle. End quote. And so the eternal return, the overcoming of the supreme obstacle, this false view of ourselves wandered through the consciousness. And the equally false view, we might correlate that first view with the free will, and then the view of unfree will that Nietzsche equally dispenses with in Beyond Good and Evil, bound by mechanistic causes. How does he achieve this? Through the disunity that one finds in the vicious circle, which nevertheless allows them to seize and establish itself through willing it to be so. That's all for this week, everyone. Join me next time when we're going to continue with this book. We're going to discuss the experience of the eternal return for Nietzsche, as well as Nietzsche's attempts to use the eternal return as a selective principle, which spills over into many implications in politics and even, I guess, ethics and Nietzsche's immoralist or amoralist sense. And Klossowski has a number of just very interesting insights that I can't wait to get to, but I thought it was very important to establish all of this work about the semiology of the impulses first, to understand or to give everyone an understanding of Nietzsche's fundamental claim of the disunity of the self and how, therefore, we can see that disunity of the self represented in the return, which is, again, I think a great insight. So join me next time for Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Part 2, The Conspiracy of the Vicious Circle. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.